Welcome to KU Padasala. Today I will be talking on Dalit studies. Dalit studies emerged in the second half of 20th century and originally it was referred to as a kind of approach that is related to the untouchables. Untouchable was a term that was used for a very long period of time to refer to the oppressed classes in India. They were excluded from the fourfold Varna system of Hinduism, that is Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. Untouchable classes were outside this very system that is devised by Hinduism. It was in the 1880s that Mahatma Jyotiba Phule used the term Dalit for the first time. Actually, Dalita, a Sanskrit term, means broken or shattered. So, the term Dalit would have been used to refer to the shattered people or the broken people or those who were oppressed by the upper caste majority. It was in the 1970s that the term Dalit reappeared again with the emergence of the Dalit Panthers movement in Maharashtra. The Dalit Panthers movement popularized the term and it became a kind of term that represents the whole of oppressed sections of the society, especially the untouchable classes in India. The Dalit Panthers were founded in 1972, inspired by the Black Panthers movement in the United States of America. The Dalit Panthers attempted to fuse the philosophies of Ambedkar, Phule and Marx. When we think about Dalit movement, there are several misconceptions about the term. Who is a Dalit? What is meant by Dalit? And whether all untouchable people or people who were born in untouchable castes can be considered as Dalits, or Dalit is a term that is attained or acquired through a process. These are certain doubts that may emerge in the mind of scholars or ordinary people. Actually, Dalit is not a caste. A Dalit is not born, but on the other hand, a Dalit is made. When we say that a Dalit is made, we mean that it is a kind of a subjecthood that has been attained by an individual. It is a subjecthood that is beyond the caste. Merely because one is born into a particular caste does not make him a Dalit. It is a kind of subjecthood that has been attained by him through a kind of critical understanding of the caste hierarchies within the Indian society and a kind of judicious interpretation of the caste system. We mean that it cannot be attained by birth. One does not become a Dalit merely because he belongs to an untouchable caste. On the other hand, he has to attain it through a kind of understanding, a kind of awareness, a kind of in-depth study of the contemporary situation and the desire to go beyond the caste hierarchies that exist in our society. So, Dalit studies becomes a kind of attempt to reinterpret the society, and Dalit status is something that is acquired through a conscious attempt on the part of the individual to identify the gaps and silences within our society, within our history and within our culture. It is an attempt to inquire how certain sections of the society were silenced by the hegemonic powers, in the case of India, the upper caste. It is also an attempt to develop discourses on the past, present and future of the untouchables in order to help them to find a place in history, a place in culture, a place in literature. And this is actually a conscious effort on the part of the individual. So, Dalits becomes a kind of a term that refers to a group of people who consciously intervenes in the social process in order to reform it, in order to refigure it, in order to recreate it. So, in that sense, we find that Dalit studies attempts to reinterpret our society. We know that through history, it is clear that the untouchable class is absent in history. We do not find references to the untouchable class in the written history. They were not found in literary works as well. As referred earlier, they were outside the Varna system as well. They were absent in art and philosophy. So, the so called historians of the world as well as literature and art and philosophy attempted to oust the untouchables from the written history. So, the Dalit intelligentsia is attempting to figure out the culture, art and literature of the untouchables from the margins of history. They have been silenced, and the Dalit thinkers are attempting to find the voice, unearth the voice that has been silenced for centuries. So, we find that Dalit studies is an attempt to find out the history, art, literature that has been produced by the untouchable classes from immemorial times. So, Dalit studies cannot be considered as a kind of an approach that is similar to other approaches to history or literature, like various movements or theoretical movements like formalism or post structuralism or structuralism, etc. Dalit studies is a totally different kind of approach, which is somewhat similar to feminist movements, black movements, etc. Because all these movements were connected with a kind of desire to assert the identity, an attempt to establish the identity of a particular class of people, a particular group of people, women as well as the blacks. So, Dalit movement is similar to those movements and not to other kinds of approaches that we come across in literature or philosophy. And another important misconception about Dalit studies is that Dalit is often considered to be a part of Hinduism, a branch of Hinduism or a section of Hinduism. It is to be clear, it is to be made clear that Dalit is not a branch or a section of the Hindu religion. On the other hand, it is an antithesis to Hinduism, because we know that Hinduism from the beginning has been dominated by the Brahmanic practices, and the Brahmanism is an ideology that ousted the untouchables out of history, art, culture and religion. They have silenced the untouchables, and at the same time, even though they have silenced the untouchables, they tried to keep them under their own fold. And Hinduism has not only silenced the untouchables, but also denied them education, denied them the right to live, the right for self assertion and the right for life as a respectable individual. We know that from time immemorial the untouchables were denied education. They were not treated as decent individuals. They have not been allowed to walk through public roads. They have not been allowed to wear a decent dress. So, at the same time, the Dalits were, or the so called untouchables were considered to be Hindus, even though they were denied all kinds of rights that other Hindus enjoy, including entry into the temples. And we are remembered of many struggles in different parts of India, including Kerala, for temple entry. In 1936, the Vaikam Satyagraham, etc. And the struggles of Mahatma Ayangali for the right to walk through public roads, the right to wear decent dress. His Villuvandi Yatra is a very good example of such a struggle for the basic rights of the individual. So, it is clear that even though Dalits were considered to be Hindus, they were outside Hinduism, and Dalit studies is actually a kind of antithesis to Hinduism. It is a criticism of Hinduism. It is a criticism of the Brahmanic practices which dominated Hinduism, and the very aim of Dalit studies is to overcome the conditioning of the Brahmanic ideology. And we find that the duty of Dalit studies thus becomes a kind of deconstruction of the existing belief systems, the Hindu belief systems based on the Brahmanical ideology. So, Dalits is a particular kind of term that refer to a kind of approach that is against the dominant Hindu Brahmanical ideology. And another important misconception about Dalit studies is that Dalit is a kind of a term that refers to a movement or a group that existed from immemorial times. It is also wrong, because Dalit is a very recent term. It emerged in the 1960s, or it began to be used in a particular sense from the 1960s, and it emerged in a particular historical context. And the historical context is the emergence of movements in different parts of the world to assert the identity of certain groups who were denied a decent social status even by the liberal democracy. It was expected that liberal democracies will ensure social status for all. That was the kind of belief that people had when they embraced liberal democracies in different parts of the world, including India. But after some time, especially after 1960s, women and blacks and the untouchables in India began to realize the fact that liberal democracy failed in providing proper space for groups like Dalits or the untouchables in India and the blacks and women in all parts of the world. So, it is this kind of an awareness that led to the emergence of Dalit studies or the Dalit movements. So, these movements we can say originated out of the failure of the democratic system, which could not accommodate them. And we find that in India there were several movements, several leaders who attempted to make sure that the Dalits get equal share of power. We know the huge debate between Mahatma Gandhi and Ambedkar regarding the representation of the Dalit. But Gandhi tried to believe that, or he actually believed that he will be able to ensure proper space for the Dalits, and he named them Harijans. But his attempt to create a space for the Dalits or the untouchable classes was a failure, and that is why we find that the untouchable classes rejected to a great extent the name Harijan, and that was used by Mahatma Gandhi and popularized by him. They also realized that they will not get justice through the kind of measures taken by the government to appease them. So, Dalit studies and Dalit movements emerged in such a context in which they realized the failure of the efforts of the liberal democratic governments, and the nation as a whole, it is believed that failed in providing space for them. Because the basic defect that we find in nationalism is that Indian nationalism was framed, or it was conceived based on the Hindu upper caste belief systems. We know that nationalism was a kind of a movement that emerged against the colonial power. So, in order to oppose the colonial power, nationalist movement, especially Mahatma Gandhi, used several images, and most of those images were Hindu images. We come across certain concepts like Ramarajya, for example. They were typical Hindu images, upper caste Hindu images that were appealing to the Hindu majority. But at the same time, we find that nationalism failed in accommodating the untouchable classes. And there is a general belief that Hinduism is a very tolerant religion. It is also believed that Hinduism is a highly pluralistic kind of religion. But we find that in practice, we find that the untouchable classes who were considered to be part of Hinduism, they were denied all kinds of rights. So, the tolerance of Hinduism actually was non-existent in practice, because the so called untouchables were denied even basic rights of an individual. And nationalism that projected the Hindu images and Hindu ideology also tried to marginalize the untouchable classes. And that is why Dalit movement attempts to project to foreground the assumptions of the untouchable classes as against the mainstream Brahmanic assumptions of the nationalist movement. So, nationalism resulted in the continuing silencing or continued silencing of the untouchables, and not in the liberation of the untouchables. So, we come across several statements by the nationalist leaders, especially by Jawaharlal Nehru. One of the term is unity in diversity, which is extremely popular, we study in textbooks. But unity in diversity, when it is explained, refers only to the different religious groups in India, such as Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Parsis, Sikhs, etc., Jains, Buddhists, etc. It does not refer to the untouchable classes, or we can say it excludes the untouchable classes, because they were taken for granted. They were considered to be part of Hinduism, whereas they were denied the rights of being a Hindu. So, we find that the diversity or the unity in diversity that we speak about also does not refer to one particular class, that is the untouchable classes who have been denied justice for thousands of years. And when we look at a particular poem like Sarojini Naidu, another nationalist leader, there is a poem Awake. In the poem Awake, she visualizes India as a mother, the nation as a mother, and she refers to different children of India. And in her reference, there comes Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis and Sikhs as the children of Mother India. She also does not refer to the untouchable classes. So, we find that Sarojini Naidu and Jawaharlal Nehru and majority of the nationalist leaders except Ambedkar never referred to the caste or the untouchable classes. May not be because they were not aware of the untouchables and their problems, but nationalism attempted to foreground the Hindu identity and the upper caste identity rather than the untouchable identity. There were several movements even before the nationalist movement came or gained momentum. Ayangali lived and worked during that time, Phule lived and worked during that time. In many parts of India there were several movements against caste, but nationalist movement either tried to ignore it or tried to accommodate it and silenced it. So, the untouchable is absent in the nationalist ideology as well. And so, from this it is clear that the Dalit studies and Dalit movement originated out of a real need to project the ideology of the untouchable classes, and they tried to argue against the upper caste Hindu ideology. And another important misconception about Dalit writing in general and Dalit studies is that Dalit writing is related to the pain, the expression of the pain and sufferings of the untouchables. If you write about the sufferings of the untouchables, all kinds of pain suffered by them and their own experiences of caste oppression in their life, it is Dalit writing. Actually, this is a misconception. It is true that Dalits often write about their sufferings, their pains, their own experiences. The autobiographies written by most of the Dalit writers is an example for that. Some of the poems also contain, certain novels also contain such experiences. But Dalit studies is not merely about these pains and sufferings. It is actually a kind of a philosophical interpretation or a critical reinterpretation of the existing social practices, the existing social prejudices. It is not just a kind of document of the sufferings of the Dalits. It tries to reinterpret history, reinterpret the existing social practices, existing belief systems. So, it did not originate out of mere sufferings, but it originated out of the hegemony of the Brahminical ideology, because it is the hegemony of the Brahminical ideology that suppressed, discriminated and ousted the untouchables from history, literature and philosophy. And it is their hegemony that resulted in the emergence of Dalit studies, because Dalits have to, the untouchable classes have to oppose it, they have to assert their identity, and so Dalit studies emerged. So, it is an attempt to project their identity, their criticism of the contemporary caste based social system, their criticism of the Hindu religious practices that bases itself on the Brahminic ideology, their criticism of the nationalist ideology that most often bases itself on the Hindu practices. So, by and large Dalit studies is an attempt to project the criticism of the untouchable classes against the discrimination based on caste that is prevalent in our society. So, we have to understand Dalit studies in this context. Thank you very much for listening.